The sun hung low over the red cliffs, spilling long shadows across the valley where the cottonwoods swayed in the breeze. The land was quiet, almost too quiet, a kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest until he wondered if he truly belonged there. The abandoned ranch sat at the center of it all, its roof sagging under years of neglect, its windows black as if keeping secrets. Few dared to wander this far from the nearest settlement, and those who had spoken of the place carried stories that smelled of ghost tales told over whiskey. But he came anyway. He came because he needed a place. Any place to start over. The ranch wasn't much to look at, but it had bones. Strong timbers still held its frame, and with a steady hand and a bit of patience, it could stand proud again. That was enough reason for him to stay. He had no family waiting, no one to write to, no ties binding him to the towns back east. The land out here in the late 1800s was both promise and peril, but it was free from the shadows he had left behind. So he chose the ranch. He chose the silence. He chose to breathe in the scent of dust and sagebrush instead of factory, smoke in crowded streets. But the land wasn't empty. It never had been. Every tree and ridge held stories older than his name, older than the fences he planned to mend. The ranch itself stood on soil once walked by generations of Apache families, though that truth was something men like him rarely spoke of out loud. He had heard whispers about them, people who moved with the land rather than against it. People who knew the ridges and rivers the way a man knows his own heartbeat. To him they were just shadows of a past he figured was fading. Until the day he saw her, it happened without warning. He was carrying a pail of water from the creek, sweat dampening his shirt when he felt eyes on him. At first he thought it was just the stillness of the valley playing tricks again. But when he turned, she was there. Standing at the edge of the trees, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her face unflinching as she studied him. She did not move. She did not blink. It was as though she had stepped straight out of the earth itself, and for a long moment, neither did he. She wasn't dressed like the women he had known in town. Her clothes were simple but carried patterns he didn't recognize, stitched carefully by hand. She stood tall with the strength of someone who knew every stone and stream of this land. There was no fear in her eyes, only something sharper curiosity mixed with caution. He realized, with a tightening in his chest, that this might be the first time she had ever laid eyes on someone like him. A stranger. A white man. His mind raced. He knew enough to understand the danger of this moment. Men had been killed for less than setting foot on land not their own, and yet she didn't reach for a weapon, though he noticed a knife at her side. She only watched him, silent, as if weighing what kind of man he was. He lowered the pail slowly, the cool water sloshing against the rim, and tried to find words. But none came. The air between them carried too much history, too much silence, too much unknown. The world around seemed to pause. Even the wind through the cottonwoods stilled, waiting for one of them to make the first move. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the dry rasp of fear tangled with something else, something he couldn't yet name. She tilted her head just slightly, her eyes narrowing, as though she had already read more of him than he wished to share. And in that instant, he understood something. This meeting would change everything. His life. The ranch. The silence he had clung to it would all shift because of the woman standing before him. He wanted to ask her name, but somehow it felt wrong, like breaking a spell. Instead, he took one step forward. She did not retreat, though her hand brushed the hilt of her knife, reminding him that her trust was not yet given. Her breath was steady, her gaze unbroken. He felt the weight of the valley pressing in, the cliffs towering above, as if they too were witnesses to this unlikely encounter. A ranch abandoned by men now stood as the meeting place of two, worlds that had never touched. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak her, branch cracked in the woods behind her. She turned her head sharply, her expression shifting from calm to alert in an instant. The sound was quick, like a footstep retreating into the brush. He looked past her, but saw only shadows. When her eyes snapped back to his, there was no longer just curiosity in them. There was warning. Whatever peace had rested in that moment had been disturbed, and neither of them knew what came next. He felt the urge to call out. to break the silence with anything that might hold her there a little longer. But before he could, she stepped back into the trees, melting into the green as though she had never been there at all. Only the faint sway of leaves showed where she had passed. He stood frozen, the pail still at his feet, heart thundering with the knowledge that this was no dream. She was real, and she had seen him. That night he could not sleep. Every creak of the old ranch house carried her face in his mind. The way she had looked at him steady, searching, would not leave him. He thought about what it meant, what might come of it. Was she alone? Or were there others watching from the hills, measuring whether this stranger belonged here or deserved to be driven out? The land, once quiet, no longer felt empty. It felt alive. It felt watchful. By morning, he knew one truth. He would see her again. Whether by fate or by choice, the paths of the ranch and the woman in the trees were now tied. But what lay ahead, friendship, conflict, or something far more dangerous, remained hidden in the silence of the valley. And as he stepped out onto the porch, the rising sun casting light over the broken fences and the fields yet to be tamed, he could not shake the feeling that eyes were still on him, waiting, and somewhere beyond the trees. She was waiting too. The days that followed moved slow, the kind of slow that made a man notice every sound. Every rustle of grass, every crow cutting across the sky. He tried to work on the ranch, mending the fences, clearing brush, and hauling water. But his mind was never fully in the task. Each time he bent to lift a log or stooped to hammer a board, his thoughts circled back to her, the Apache woman. The way she had stood there, unafraid, watching him as though he were some creature she had never known could exist. He replayed the look in her eyes over and over, trying to make sense of what it meant. At night, when the coyotes sang from the hills, he lay awake inside the creaking cabin, staring at the rafters. He had seen plenty of hardship in his life. He had buried family, lost friends, and wandered west because there was nothing left to keep him back east. But this was different. This was something new. For the first time since arriving, he felt less like he had chosen the ranch and more like the land itself had chosen him. It was as if the abandoned place had been waiting for him to find it, to cross paths with someone who belonged to it in a way he never could. The ranch itself carried history. The locals in town had warned him of it, though their words had been wrapped more in fear than fact. Some said the family who built it years ago had been driven off after a raid. Others whispered about sickness that had swept through and left the place hollow. No one could agree on the truth. But what all the stories shared was one common thread. The ranch had been left to rot for a reason. A smart man would have taken that as warning and kept moving, but he had no place else to go, and in the silence of the valley, found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. Still, silence was a strange thing. It could comfort, or it could gnaw at the back of a man's skull. Lately, it was the latter. He couldn't walk to the creek without glancing at the tree line, couldn't sit on the porch without feeling eyes on him. Once, while splitting wood, he thought he caught a flicker of movement between the cottonwoods. By the time he looked closer, it was gone. He wondered if she was watching him still, testing him, waiting for him to show whether he came with peace or harm. One morning, he found signs. Near the creek, the damp soil held footprints not his own. Smaller, lighter, but fresh enough that they could only belong to her. His stomach tightened at the sight. She had come close again, close enough to leave her mark by the water. She could have taken the pail, could have destroyed it if she wanted. But she hadn't. She left it untouched, as though reminding him that she was there and that she allowed him to stay. He began to wonder about her life beyond the trees. Was she truly alone? Had her people moved on and left her behind? Or did they linger in the hills, unseen, just out of reach? He knew better than to assume she had no one. The Apache were not ghosts, no matter how the settlers liked to paint them. They were flesh and blood, fierce and watchful, and the land still belonged to them, even as towns pushed westward. If she was here, then surely others were as well. That thought pressed against him heavier than the solitude. He wasn't just sharing this valley with her. He might be trespassing on something sacred. The work on the ranch gave him time to think. though thinking only sharpened the unease. He patched the roof, pulled weeds from the long-abandoned garden, and cut poles for a new corral, but his hands worked slower than they should have. Every sound of snapping twigs, every shift in the wind made him pause. The ranch was no longer just a shelter for him. It had become a stage where unseen eyes measured every choice he made. He began to leave small signs of his own, though he wasn't sure why. A piece of bread left on a flat stone near the creek. A carved notch in a fence post shaped like a spiral. Something simple, but deliberate. He didn't know if she ever noticed, but it eased his mind to think she might. When he made the rare trip into town, he kept his thoughts to himself. The townsfolk had their suspicions about him already, why a man would choose to live alone on a place with such a reputation. He heard the mutters in the saloon, the sideways looks when he bought supplies. If they knew an Apache woman had been near the ranch, the whispers would turn to something worse. They would ride out in groups with rifles and fire, calling it justice when it was only fear. So he told no one. He carried the secret back with him, burying it deeper each time the wagon wheels rolled over the dusty road. But secrets have weight, and he could feel this one pressing heavier each day. He didn't know her name, didn't know her voice, yet she was more real to him than anyone in the crowded saloon. Sometimes he thought of her stepping from the trees again, and he practiced in his head what he might say if given the chance. He would speak slow, his voice even, his hands open. He would tell her he meant no harm, that he sought only to live quietly on the ranch. But words were brittle things, and he doubted they could bridge the space between them. The season turned warmer, the grass thickening across the meadows, the sky sharp and blue over the red cliffs. With each passing day, the land pulled him deeper in. He hunted for deer in the hills, fished the creek for trout, planted seeds in the garden plot, hoping to coax life from soil that had sat barren too long. Yet he never felt alone in these tasks. He felt her presence even when he could not see her. Sometimes he caught faint smoke on the wind, as though a fire burned somewhere beyond the ridge. Sometimes he found a feather tucked in the split of a log, too carefully placed to be chance. These were not accidents. She was leaving traces just as he had. The ranch, once silent, now breathed with unseen life, and with it came unease that cut deeper than fire. It was uncertainty. He didn't know what she wanted from him, or what her people might decide if they judged him unworthy. He only knew that something bound them now, something neither of them had chosen but neither could ignore. One night, as the moon rose pale and full over the valley, he sat on the porch with a lantern flickering at his side. The wind was still, the crickets singing steady in the grass. Then he heard it, a soft sound carried through the dark like the faint notes of a song. It was distant, almost swallowed by the night, but real enough to raise the hair on his arms. The tune was nothing he recognized, and it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. He leaned forward, straining his ears, but the silence returned, heavy and unbroken. Sleep did not come to him after that. He sat awake, staring at the line of trees, waiting for the shape of her to appear. But the night gave him nothing more. Only the memory of that song lingered, as if meant to remind him that the valley had a voice, and he was only beginning to hear it. By the next morning, he was more certain than ever that this place was not his alone. The ranch was not simply abandoned land waiting for a new hand to tame it. It was a crossroads, a meeting ground where two worlds pressed against each other. He had stepped onto it blind, but now the blindfold was slipping. And though he tried to steady himself with work and routine, he knew the moment was coming when silence would no longer hold. Each day carried that same tension forward. Each sunrise felt like the start of something unseen. Each sunset like a warning that tomorrow would bring change. He could not say when or how, but he felt it in his bones. The woman from the trees had not vanished. She was close, watching, waiting. And when their paths crossed again, the quiet balance of the valley would shatter. For now, kept working, kept breathing, kept listening. The mystery deepened with every footprint near the creek. Every flicker of smoke on the horizon, every song carried faintly through the night. He was no longer just a man living on an abandoned ranch. He was part of a story older and larger than himself, a story still unfolding in the shadows of the red cliffs. and though he did not yet know whether he had stepped into danger or into fate, he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The ranch had begun to feel like a fragile outpost balanced between two worlds. And each day he woke with the sense that something unseen pressed closer. His tools lay where he left them. His small garden sprouted green shoots. The fences stood a little straighter, but none of it eased, the unease coiling tighter with every passing week. The valley no longer felt abandoned. It felt watched one evening. As the sky turned crimson against the cliffs, he heard movement beyond the corral. He set down the hammer in his hand and listened. The horses he had traded for in town were restless, stamping and snorting as if they caught a scent on the air. He gripped the axe leaning by the porch, his eyes straining toward the line of trees. At first he thought it was only his mind against his nerves, sharpening ordinary sounds into threats. But then he saw it. A figure at the tree line, still as stone, half hidden by the brush. It wasn't her this time. This figure was taller, broader at the shoulders, standing with a wariness that told him whoever it was had no intention of being friendly. By the time he blinked, the figure had slipped back into the dark, leaving only the sound of crickets. The encounter chilled him more than he admitted, because it confirmed what he had already suspected: she wasn't alone. She had people here, maybe a whole band, watching from the ridges, measuring his every action. Perhaps the night he saw her was no accident at all, but a test. Maybe the bread left on the stone, the carved spiral in the post, all of it had been read and judged by eyes he never saw. He wondered how long they had been moving through the valley before he came. And if his presence was tolerated only for now, still her face lingered in his thoughts. She was not a ghost or a shadow. She was flesh and blood, a woman of the land, carrying with her a life and a history he would never fully understand. The memory of her steady gaze was not something he could shake, no matter how much he tried to keep his focus on repairs and chores. And though fear gnawed at him, so did something else, an odd pull, a curiosity that was just as strong as the unease. Tension grew sharper when word from town reached him that ranchers further south had been losing cattle. The men in the saloon spat the blame on roving bands without hesitation, their voices loud and thick with anger. Talk turned quickly to rifles and posses, and though he kept to himself, he knew their suspicions would spread wide. If they caught wind of who moved near his ranch, trouble would come down like a hammer. He felt torn in two directions, torn silence. To protect the valley and those who belonged to it, and to ward fear, knowing how swift and brutal men could be once they believed they were under threat. The days stretched on, and with them came signs that unsettled him further. Once while checking the traps he'd set by the creek, he found them emptied but not broken. Whoever had been there had taken the catch and left the trap unharmed, as if to show they had power but no need to destroy. Another morning, he discovered a woven strand of grass tied carefully around the handle of his water pail. The message was clear enough: he was not unseen. The question was whether these gestures were warnings, or something more complicated. The ranch grew into its own character in his story, its worn walls and sagging beams standing like the last link to a forgotten past. But it was not just his shelter anymore. It had become a meeting ground, a place where silence itself seemed to speak. Each creak of the boards at night felt like footsteps of someone long gone. Each gust of wind through the gaps in the roof carried with it a question: was he intruder or ally? He found himself watching the horizon differently now. Each ride into town felt heavier, like a man carrying a secret that could cost him dearly. Once, at the general store, a ranch hand asked why he stayed out on that cursed ground. He shrugged, gave no answer, and left quickly. But the man's suspicion stuck with him. The truth was, he could not have explained it even if he wanted to. Something bound him to that valley. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe fate, or maybe it was the dark-haired woman whose eyes still burned into his thoughts. When he saw her again, it was not as he expected. The morning was clear, the air sharp with the scent of pine drifting down from the ridges. He was hauling wood when he heard a rustle near the barn. Turning, he found her there, closer than she had ever been before. She did not hide this time. She stood in plain sight, her hand resting near her knife, her gaze steady but guarded. His breath caught, and for a long heartbeat neither of them moved. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, a gesture of peace he hoped would be understood. His voice cracked the silence, though soft and low. He told her he meant no harm, that he only wished to live quiet and alone on the ranch. She said nothing, but her eyes followed his lips, her expression unreadable. Then, with one swift glance toward the hills, she turned and was gone again, leaving him standing in the yard with his heart pounding in his chest. That brief moment changed everything. She had chosen to come close, chosen to reveal herself once more, and he could not shake the meaning of it. If she had wanted to drive him off, she could have done so with ease. The fact that she hadn't meant something, though what he could not say, but the valley was not free of shadows. That very week riders passed near the ranchmen from town, armed and restless, talking loud about raids and missing cattle. He kept low inside, his lantern dark, his hand close to the rifle he never wanted to use. The men didn't stop, but their voices carried sharp in the night. And he knew it was only a matter of time before they cast their eyes his way. He began to feel the walls closing in, pressure from both sides. On one hand, the settlers ready to strike out at any sign of Apache presence. On the other, the silent watchers in the trees, weighing whether he could be trusted. He stood between them like a man walking a rope stretched over a canyon. One misstep enough to send him falling. As the days warmed, the garden began to grow, though he noticed new tracks through the soil, lighter than his own. Once, he found a small bundle of herbs laid carefully on the porch, their scent sharp and unfamiliar. It was no accident. She, or perhaps her people, had left them. He held them in his hand, wondering if it was meant as a gift, a warning, or a test. The ranch became a place of layered meaning, each object carrying weight. A bundle of herbs, a tied strand of grass, a footprint by the creek, all of them signs in a language he did not know but felt in his bones. He could no longer see the valley as empty land waiting to be tamed. It was alive, steeped in stories, and he had stepped into the middle of them without understanding their rules. The conflict tightened around him, not just of land and people but inside himself. He had come west to escape, to live in quiet, to rebuild something of a life. Now he stood at the edge of something larger, something he had not sought, but could not walk away from. Each night he asked himself the same question: would he become part of the valley, or would the valley swallow him whole? And always, in the back of his mind, was the image of her standing at the edge of the barn, silent but unflinching, her eyes carrying more than words ever could. He did not yet know whether she was his warning or his chance at survival. But he knew one truth more deeply than any other. The story was only beginning, and whatever path lay ahead, it would be written in the silence between them. The valley held its breath in those weeks, as though every living thing sensed that something was coming. The ranch felt less like a place to live, and more like a stage where unseen forces were drawing closer, waiting for their moment. He worked as much as ever, repairing the corral, clearing brush from the fields, mending the roof with scraps of timber he hauled in from town. But even as his hands moved, his mind carried a weight that could not be shaken. The air itself seemed heavy, charged with something unspoken. Like the stillness before a storm, every sound sharpened his nerves. The crack of a branch in the night set his heart racing. The sudden flight of birds from the cottonwoods left him frozen in place. Sometimes, while drawing water at the creek, he swore he heard whispers, faint voices carried by the wind. And always there was the knowledge that eyes were on him, watching from the ridges, measuring his every step. It was no longer only her. The others were there too. He could feel their presence like shadows stretched across the land. The woman had returned again, but never in the same way. Once she appeared at dawn, standing near the half-broken fence, her dark hair catching the rising sun. Another time she emerged from the trees as he fished, watching silently before disappearing once more. Each meeting was brief, a fragment of something larger, but each one pulled him deeper into her world. He wanted to speak, to bridge the silence, but the words always caught in his throat. And each time she vanished, the valley seemed to close tighter around him, holding its secrets just beyond reach. What unsettled him most was not her presence, but the silence of her people. They had not yet revealed themselves fully, but he knew they were near. He found signs ashes of a small fire hidden in a hollow, footprints crossing the meadow at night. A spearhead wedged into a fence post, as if planted deliberately. None of these were accidents. They were messages, though he could not read them. Were they warnings to leave? Or invitations to prove himself? At the same time, danger pressed in from the other side. The townsfolk grew louder in their suspicions, louder in their talk of Apache raids and stolen cattle. He had heard men at the saloon speaking of forming a search party, rifles in hand, to clear out anyone hiding in the hills. He said nothing, nursed his drink in silence, but the words chilled him more than any empty night in the valley. If those men rode out here, blood would be spilled. The ranch he had tried to build would be consumed in fire. The pressure grew unbearable, and his nights became restless. Sleep brought dreams of the woman's eyes, steady and unreadable, staring at him across a gulf he could not cross. In those dreams, the ranch was burning, cliffs ringing with the sound of gunfire, and he stood trapped between two worlds tearing each other apart. He woke, each time drenched in sweat, the lantern guttering low. The silence around him too sharp to bear. Then came the night that changed everything. A pale moon hung over the valley, casting silver light on the fields. He had been restless, pacing the porch, when he heard movement in the trees. Not the soft tread of one person, but many. He froze, rifle in hand, though he did not raise it, listening as shadows shifted at the edge of the woods. Slowly, figures emerged. Half a dozen, maybe more, stepping out into the moonlight. Apache men, faces hard, eyes sharp, weapons slung at their sides. They stood in a line, silent, staring at him. His throat went dry, his pulse hammering in his chest, and then she stepped forward from among them. The woman, her face calm, but her gaze fierce, as though she carried the weight of both her people and the valley itself. She spoke words he did not understand, her voice low but steady, and the others listened. One of the men spat into the dirt, glaring at him with eyes that held nothing but distrust. Another lifted a spear, tapping it once against the ground, as if to test his nerve. He stood frozen, not daring to move. Knowing one wrong step could end everything, he lowered the rifle slowly, letting it fall to the porch boards with a dull thud. Then he raised his hands, palms open, showing he came without threat. His chest ached from the force of his heartbeat. For a moment no one moved. Then she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his, searching for something in his face. He wished he could speak her language, wished he could tell her he sought only peace, but silence was all he had to give. Finally, with a sharp glance at the others, she motioned for them to retreat. One by one, they melted back into the trees until only she remained. She lingered for a breath longer, her eyes never leaving his, and she too vanished. He stood on the porch for hours after, staring at the place where they had been. His hands still shook, his breath ragged. But beneath the fear was something else, a sense that the valley had reached a turning point. He had been seen, judged, and for now spared. But what came next he could not guess. The following days were worse than any before. The tension was unbearable, the silence sharper than ever. He went about his work, but each task felt hollow. He could feel the weight of what had passed, that he had been tested, and that more tests would come. At night he sat awake, lantern dark, listening to the wind scrape through the trees. He felt as though the valley itself waited for him to make a choice, though no choice was clear. When he next saw her, it was in the daylight, near the creek. She appeared suddenly, as though the forest had opened to let her through. He froze. His breath caught in his chest as she bent to fill a pouch with water. For the first time she looked at him not with suspicion, but with something else, something that almost felt like recognition. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fall away. Then, just as quickly, it was over. She straightened, turned, and slipped back into the trees without a word, but the look lingered.
Out!
It told him there was more beneath her silence than he had realized, and it filled him with both hope and dread, because hope was dangerous in a valley like this. Trouble in town reached its peak soon after. A rancher's boy had gone missing for a night, and when he returned, scratched and bruised, The men claimed it was an Apache ambush. Whether it was truth or fear didn't matter. The townsfolk armed themselves, preparing to ride out and settle the matter once and for all. He overheard their plans at the saloon, their voices filled with anger and drink, and his stomach turned cold. They spoke of searching the valley, clearing out every shadow until nothing remained. He rode back fast that evening, the horse lathered with sweat, his mind racing. If they came, the ranch would be caught in the middle. He stood on the porch as the sun set behind the red cliffs, watching the trees sway in the breeze, knowing she was out there, knowing her people were close, and he knew what was coming. The valley was no longer just a quiet refuge, it was a fuse waiting for a spark. On one side, the townsfolk with their rifles and fear. On the other, the Apache, fierce and proud, unwilling to surrender their land. And in the center stood him, a man who had only wanted a place to start over, now bound to a conflict older and larger than himself. The nights grew colder despite the season, the wind carrying with it the scent of smoke from hidden fires in the hills. He felt it in his bones that something was about to break. He saw it in the restless eyes of his horses, in the sudden silence of birds before dusk, in the shadows that lingered longer at the tree line. Each day built higher with tension, each night deeper with dread. And then, one evening, as the last light bled from the sky, he heard it. The sound of riders in the distance, their voices hard, their rifles clattering. From the other direction came the answering call of drums, faint but steady, echoing from the ridges. Two worlds moving toward one another, and he stood in the middle. The ranch trembling beneath the weight of what was to come. He tightened his grip on the porch rail, his breath ragged, his heart thundering as the valley seemed to darken around him. Everything he had tried to build, every silence he had endured, every glance from her eyes, it had all led here. The storm was no longer coming. It was already at the edge of the valley, and there would be no turning back. The drums from the ridges rolled like thunder through the valley, and the hoofbeats of the riders from town pounded closer with each breath. The ranch, which had once been nothing more than a broken-down refuge, now stood at the heart of two worlds colliding. He could feel the tension pressing down, heavier than the cliffs that loomed above. For a moment he wondered if this would be the place where everything ended his life, the silence of the valley, perhaps even the fragile thread that tied him to the Apache woman. The riders reached the edge of the field as twilight bled across the sky. Lanterns swung from their saddles, casting sharp glimmers of light across rifle barrels. He recognized some of their faces from town, men who had laughed too loudly in the saloon, who now rode with jaws clenched and eyes narrowed, spurred on by fear. They halted near the corral, their horses restless, snorting clouds of steam into the cool air from the ridges. Shadows moved, figures stepping into view, painted with the glow of firelight, weapons at their sides. The Apache men stood tall, silent and unmoving, their presence enough to make the riders curse under their breath. It was a standoff, the kind of moment where one wrong word could ignite the valley into chaos. He stood on the porch, caught in the middle, every nerve screaming. His rifle leaned against the wall, but he didn't touch it. He knew that weapon, once raised, would bring only blood. Instead, he stepped down into the dirt, hands open at his sides, his voice carrying across the tense silence. He told the men from town that no cattle were hidden here, that the ranch was his alone, and that spilling blood on this ground would only poison it for all of them. They shouted back, accusing, their words sharp, accusing him of harboring savages. Fear twisted their voices into anger.
Ow.
One of them raised his rifle toward the ridges. His heart lurched, certain that was the end. But before the shot could crack, a figure stepped from the line of trees. The Apache woman, her face calm, her eyes unwavering even as rifles pointed her way. She walked with measured steps, stopping between the two sides, her silhouette framed against the firelight. The men cursed, their rifles twitching. But she did not flinch. She spoke in her own tongue, her voice carrying steady and clear through the valley. He didn't know the words, but he felt their weight, their rhythm. She turned then, her eyes finding his, and in that look he understood she was asking him, to stand with her, to make himself a bridge where none had been before. He stepped forward, his chest tight, and raised his voice again. This time he spoke not just to calm the riders, but to remind them of their own humanity. He told them that the valley had belonged to others long before the ranch or the town, that spilling blood here would not bring peace, only endless vengeance. He spoke of the silence of the land, of how it held room enough for all if only they would let it. His words were raw, halting, but they carried truth. The riders shifted uneasily. Some muttered, some spat into the dirt, but none pulled their triggers. The Apache men on the ridges remained still, watching with sharp eyes, waiting. And then, slowly, the riders turned their horses. One by one, with curses and angry glances, they rode back toward town, their lanterns bobbing into the distance, until only darkness remained. The valley was silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, filled with the echo of what might have been. The Apache men melted back into the ridges, their eyes lingering on him before vanishing into the dark. She remained a moment longer, standing by the creek, her gaze fixed on him. For the first time she gave the faintest nod, a gesture so small it might have been missed. Then she too slipped away, leaving him alone once more. The ranch stood quiet in the aftermath. He sat on the porch long into the night, lantern at his side, his thoughts tangled. He had not solved anything fully. Town. Fear still lingered, Apache eyes still watched, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn, and he had chosen where he stood. The days that followed were gentler. He found no threats carved into the wood of his fence. No signs of anger left at the creek. Instead, once he found a woven bracelet of grass left on the porch rail. Another time a piece of smoked venison wrapped in leaves rested by the door. Small gestures perhaps, but they spoke louder than words. They told him he had not been cast out. He had been acknowledged, if not yet trusted. Life on the ranch steadied. The garden grew stronger, the corral held, and the horses quieted in their stalls. He still worked alone, but no longer felt abandoned. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as though it had weathered the storm along with him. Each evening he sat on the porch and watched the sun bleed across the cliffs, waiting, half hoping, for another glimpse of her. When she did appear again, it was not with a line of warriors at her back, but alone, as she had the first time. She stood by the trees, watching, her face calm. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he felt something pass between them in the silence. Not friendship, not yet, but recognition. They were no longer strangers. They were two people bound by the same valley, standing at the edge of something larger than either of them could name. He never did learn her words, nor she his. Their exchanges remained in gestures, in nods, in the faintest traces left at the creek or the porch. But that was enough. It was enough to know that in a land divided by fear and mistrust, there was still space for understanding, however small. The ranch grew stronger with each season. What had once been abandoned now lived again, its fields seeded, its roof patched, its fences upright. It stood as proof that the land could hold more than ghosts and fear. It could hold new beginnings. If only a man was willing to listen. Looking back, he understood the truth of it all. He had come west searching for a place to escape his past, but what he found was something different. He found a valley that demanded respect, a people who carried stories older than any ranch or town, and a woman who had shown him the silence between worlds could be bridged without words. The conflicts had not vanished. The townsfolk still muttered in fear, the Apache still watched from the ridges, and the valley still carried scars of both. But for him, the ranch was no longer just a refuge. It was a promise that peace was possible, that silence could speak louder than rifles, and that even in a world torn between two paths, a man could choose to stand in the middle and not break. The seasons turned. The garden flourished, and the red cliffs held steady against the sky. He lived with the knowledge that one day trouble might come again. But he also lived with the memory of her eyes, steady and unwavering, reminding him that even in the harshest land, there could be understanding. In the end, the ranch was not abandoned at all. It was alive, bound by the silence of the valley and the stories carried within it. And though his life there would always be caught between two worlds, he no longer felt alone. He had found his place, not through ownership or conquest, but through patience, through respect, and through the fragile, unspoken bond with the woman who had once stood at the edge of the trees and seen him as he truly was. The valley belonged to them both now. And in its quiet heart, something lasting remains, something stronger than fear, something worth keeping alive.